Circumcised at 99.
Uh-huh. Which is worse, 99 or 13? Sounds good. Yeah.
You ever use it?
Nope. I've never even
Probably
stood
13.
inside it. I think 13's the worst possible age to get circumcised. Especially in
99, you
the
might not
Iron
even be able
Age.
to feel it.
Remember when that was a war strategy in the Bible?
Circumcising people? No, I don't remember
was it
this.
The Philistines, they all were circumcised, and then the men couldn't fight.
Oh, yeah. It's Shechem? Is it? It's
Was it the
Dinah.
Philistines?
I don't think it's Philistines. Philistines don't show up until later,
Oh,
right?
okay.
So it's Dinah's husband. At that point, I think he is almost her husband, and I can't remember his name. So it's Genesis 33 or 34.
But then a whole bunch of men
they're
get-
traveling back, and Dinah gets.
Mm-hmm.
But then I think his name might be Shechem or something like that. But he also falls in love with her and wants to marry her. And Jacob's sons say, "Okay, you can marry her, but you got to be circumcised first." So he and all the men in his camp get
Right,
circumcised.
that's right. Yeah,
and
yeah.
while they're laying around in their tents recovering, Jacob's sons come and murder them all. Yeah, it's a good story. Women love it. Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Evan.
And I'm Scott.
We're both Baptist pastors, and this is our podcast about the Bible. But don't worry, we're not trying to save your souls. We won't be telling you what to believe or how to behave, and we promise never to invite you to church. We just like to talk about the Bible, what it actually says, where it probably came from, and how it's been understood or not by different people in different times and places. This is your warning, though, especially if you are or have been a person of faith. For our purposes, the Bible is not a sacred text. During this podcast, we'll be treating the Bible more or less like any other book. While you're here, there is nothing you have to believe, there are no beliefs you can't question, and there are no questions you can't ask. Welcome to the unHoly Bible Study Podcast. Today we are continuing our mini-series, looking at some of the most significant names or name changes in the Old and the New Testament. And today we are looking at the 17th chapter of the book of Genesis. So we're headed back to Genesis. Scott, any insights since our last conversation about names? We were talking about the name of God and kind of kicked off this mini-series looking at Exodus 3. Is there anything you've thought about since that episode? Anything that's come to mind?
Well, for me, there's a shift in my mind from the name of God, which is
like a different category
a
of
different,
name.
yeah,
Yeah.
versus these names, human names, and name changes, and it's a whole different subject matter in a sense.
Yeah.
What strikes me about names in a biblical context is meaning and how name changes are associated with changes in vocation or purpose or call. That's
Yeah.
what strikes me.
Yeah. When a name, it does always feel, especially in like a piece of writing or literature, when a name gets changed, it feels really significant.
Mm-hmm.
Like there has to be a deeper meaning or a more resonant meaning.
So
in
deeply tied to identity, which that's a big deal. I mean, that's who
Yeah.
we are.
Yeah. It's such a strange thing. I think we talked a little bit about this on the first episode, but names are pretty, in reality, like practically speaking in our lives, names are pretty much arbitrary. Most children get their names before they have any personality that you can distinguish. And parents parents might have their own reasons for giving a child a name, like it might be a family name, or it might be aspirational, like I want my child to be this kind of person, or this is how I imagine them being in the world. So I'm going to give them this name that encapsulates all my hopes. But it's pretty, like, you don't have any control over that. Names are totally arbitrary, except in writing, where you get to choose how you refer to someone or what name you use for a character. Then they take on, I think, even more significance.
There's a current example of a name change right now, the Pope.
Right,
Yes. The new Pope chose a name, Pope Leo. And there was a reason he chose Pope Leo.
Have you read anything about what his reasoning was?
No, I haven't, but it just popped in him that the Pope picks a new name.
Yeah.
And or Pope Francis, I don't remember what his name was before, but Ferdinand or no.
Bertoglio, I think, was his last name. Yeah.
But it's just fascinating.
I'm going to get...
and in the Catholic tradition...
It's going to be embarrassing when that's on the internet.
Do we want to look that up?
Yeah, we'll see. Let's see how close I got it. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll just live dangerously.
Okay, so, but, also in the Catholic tradition...
Catholic scholars.
when you're baptized, you have a Christian name.
Yeah,
right?
That's true. And I don't know a whole lot about that tradition either. Is that something that has always been done, or is that like a medieval tradition?
Well,
Do you have any idea? We need to make a list of things to look up before our next episode.
I have a memory of reading this years ago that in early Christian history, the candidates for baptism were baptized in the nude.
Right. Yeah.
And so they go into the water nude, come out of the water, and then they have a new name.
Uh-huh.
So it's so
and a nice white robe.
Yeah, so powerfully, such a powerful example of like this transformed identity in Christ.
Yeah. I hadn't really thought about that tradition, but that's a great illustration of that idea of a new name, a name change, that you put on a new identity and you get a new name to go along with it. I thought of kings. I didn't think of the Pope, but I thought of when a king or queen ascends to the throne, you don't take your old name with you. You pick a throne name, and that's the one that people know you as. Like you've got a name that goes with this new role. Yeah,
it's interesting. People talk about needing a fresh start in life, sometimes, and how much more significant that would be if you had a change of name along with your fresh start. I mean, it would help, wouldn't it? It would.
I think a lot of people would say it. It does, or it would. Yeah. I think we put a lot of stock in our names, and I do think they're tied to our sense of identity in some really powerful ways. That feels like that's definitely like a uniquely human thing. I was just thinking about like animals and our practice of giving animals names. And I'm assuming animals have their own ways of telling each other apart and like knowing
or not,
like recognizing individuals. Yeah. But names are such a specifically human way to do that. And there are these moments in the Bible when names take on a lot of significance. And we're looking at one of the first ones today. So in the book of Genesis, we're introduced to the character of Abraham. We really haven't talked about Abraham that much. We've talked about Jacob, so we've talked a little bit about Abraham's family. But Abraham kind of dominates a lot of the book of Genesis. There are more than 10 chapters which are totally focused on the story of Abraham, and then it's Abraham's family that dominates the rest of the narrative after this. But how are we introduced to Abraham?
Well, the very beginning of the introduction of Abraham, he's from the land of the Chaldeans, and God calls him to leave that place behind and go to this new place, so he's the very beginning of the Jewish people.
Yeah. Looked to as the patriarch or the founding figure for Judaism. God just kind of randomly or arbitrarily, or if there's a logic to God's choice, it's not revealed in the book of Genesis. It's just God speaks to this character who suddenly appears on the scene, and God tells Abraham, go to a new land. You're going to be my person. I'm going to be your God, and I'm going to bless you. So it starts with this promise, this choice by God to choose Abraham, and the promise that Abraham is going to become a great nation, or be the founder of a great nation.
And a father at 99.
Yeah, so when the story starts, Abraham is 75, right? Like Genesis chapter 12. Abraham is 75, so he's already lived a fairly long life, and he's married, and that's when God tells him, go and start over. Now, ages in the Bible are always a little bit weird, so for among the patriarchs, 75 is maybe not as old as
It's
it might
just
seem
a spring
to us.
chicken.
Yeah. But there's still some sense that he's getting on in life and not really expecting to have children. So it's maybe a little bit unusual at the very beginning that this childless couple are promised a great multitude of descendants. But then the story continues and they don't have a child. Like they're following God, or they're following God's directions, and God's telling them kind of where to go and where to live. But the promises aren't coming.
Being
fulfilled.
So then Abraham tries to fix it with Hagar.
He does. This has already happened. There are some troubling things about this story. And one of them is that Abraham and Sarah, who we're calling him Abraham, but it's Abram. His name is Abram when the story begins. Her name is Sarai. And they don't have a child. They really want one. And Sarai suggests that Abram marry her servant, her slave, which is not a completely uncommon practice at the time, so probably wouldn't have felt all that strange to early readers or to the people who first told this story. But to us, it's a fairly horrifying idea that Sarai would just give a servant who has no choice, no consent in the matter to her husband to bear, to essentially as a uterus to bear his
surrogate
child.
Yeah.
Which she does. And Ishmael is born. And Abraham thinks, ta-da, like we did it. We've got a child. I have an heir. And now everything is going to be okay. And that happens in chapter 16, right? It's not the perfect solution Sarai envisioned. Like, it creates a lot of conflict and tension. And then we have this chapter 17, where God comes again to Abraham and reestablishes a covenant with him, and essentially rejects Ishmael in favor of a child who's not yet born, but who God promises to Abraham. Says, no, you and Sarai are going to have a baby the natural way. At this point, it's been 25 years. The story is very clear that Abraham is 99 when they're having this conversation. So he's going to be 100 years old when this new child is born. How do you read it? Do you think Abraham believes it?
Well, certainly he didn't believe it when he came up with when they came up with the Hagar idea. I mean, he went along with that thinking, well, that's a good solution. And
yeah. This must be what God meant.
I'm going to help God out,
do it this way. Yeah.
Then that's an interesting idea in and of itself, helping God out,
Yeah.
Coming up with our own solutions. to the divine plans. Just thinking about what his name is an Akkadian name, Abram is, which just means exalted father. But this whole idea of father needing to have this child, there's so much wrapped up in father and child in this whole story. And then to say you're going to be the father of many nations, many peoples, there's such a depth of reflection needed to put all this together, make sense of it.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Is this a story that's been familiar to you through the years? Is this one that's been important to you? Is this a story you remember from childhood, especially the covenant?
Oh, how could you
promise?
not? Father Abraham had many sons.
Yeah, I was going to ask about this song.
Yeah,
is it one you sung?
Yeah,
sang.
Yeah, just I remember in Sunday school standing around marching.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And this is the one where you add an arm at a time, right? Or what do you do?
It's like a Christian version of the hokey pokey, if you ask
kind
me.
of. Yeah. And then you slowly. I can never remember. Do you? I think you start one
right
arm
arm,
at a time,
left arm, right foot. Yeah.
And kind of add the motions as you go. Why is it marching? Is it? There's no reason for that, is there?
Maybe
are we Abraham's army? Is that the idea?
I don't know. There's that hint of Christian militarism goes back,
whether it makes any sense or not.
Onward, Christian soldiers marching as to war with the cross of Jesus.
Yeah.
Hate that song.
Well, it's terrible.
Yeah.
We teach it to our youngest children. Yeah. But Father Abraham that's not explicit. We're just marching for the fun of it. Yeah. I am one of them and so are you. So let's just praise the Lord. Yeah. Do you remember preaching on this passage ever?
Yeah. Well, actually, we talked about this before we started recording, that in this chapter, there's a very similar version of this in chapter 12. It has echoes of the same thing. And in my mind, this passage would have had the phrase, you're going to be a blessing.
Uh-huh.
This one doesn't have that. But
yeah.
So when I've preached on Abraham, at least I've usually landed on chapter 12, not 17.
Uh-huh. Yeah. I've certainly preached on 12 and heard 12 preached on far more than this passage. And I've preached on 15, chapter 15, more than I've preached on this one as well. Let's try to unpack two ideas before we take a break, because I think they are really important to this passage. And one is the idea of covenant. So in Genesis chapter 12, when Abraham first appears on the scene, I think even then it's explicit that God is making a covenant with Abraham, that kind of the foundation of Abram's special relationship to God is a covenant. Which is like a treaty. Is that the best metaphor?
Yeah, I wish I knew what a covenant meant in its fullest sense in those ancient times. It's an agreement. It's a promissory kind of a thing, a contract. Yeah. A covenant requires two parties at least.
Yeah.
It's not clear. Like, the terms of this covenant are not completely spelled out, I don't think.
And I think they're different. So in those, in the Abraham stories in the book of Genesis, you have this idea of a covenant, but it's like the story is told at least 3 different times. Like chapter 12, you mentioned already, we have the language of God promises to bless Abraham. And there's the suggestion that Abraham will be the father of a great nation, that he'll be wealthy and powerful. It doesn't really say what God means by blessing, but there's also this sense that Abraham is being blessed so that through him, all the families of the earth can be blessed. So this
in that context, to me, covenant is almost like call or vocation or ordination in a sense.
I think there's ethical content to it, like moral content. Like this is we're doing something for the good of the world here, and we're making an agreement, a partnership to do it together. God says, I'm gonna bless you. I'm gonna make you great. Make your descendants like the
There's an unmistakable
sand.
mandate to that.
Yeah, but there's something Abraham has to do,
Right.
too, or there's a responsibility that goes along with it. The covenant is reestablished in chapter 15. So I think there's at least 3 times when the covenant is explicitly created, and it's not totally clear whether it's supposed to be happening again or whether we just have 3 different versions of the story.
I'm guessing 3 different versions.
That feels like the most. It feels like these definitely started at least as 3 different traditions about where this covenant came from or what it was all about. Chapter 15 is the one I like the most. It's the one. It's the spooky one. Where God takes Abraham out in the middle of the night and it's the stars up in the sky. But then they actually enact this spooky ritual where animals are sacrificed and they, Abraham and God both walk among the carcasses that have been killed and mutilated. And there's this very like threatening atmosphere. It's one of my favorite stories in the Bible. It's like this ancient religious ritual that never
So
gets mentioned
inspiring.
again. Yeah. They did
Makes
inspire
me wanna-
something in me. I was like, this I would do. It's like what's the
It's like the hunting trip of all hunting trips.
yeah, it's like is it called blooding? When somebody kills their first animal in a hunt and you smear the blood all over their face. Also like a thing I've never done and never really want to do.
Well, that word primitive is important. There's so much primitive humanity in all of these stories.
Right. And primitive meaning not like basic or stupid, but just early.
Early, yeah.
Like this is how people used to be. These are ancient rituals that feel unfamiliar to modern readers. What's the thing kids do? Again, a thing I never did because I grew up after the 80s and everybody was terrified of blood. Blood brothers. Blood brothers. That's what I was thinking.
Yeah,
the thing kids do where
I
they
have
like
a couple of those.
Do you really? This is something you actually?
Oh yeah,
did?
yeah,
Oh.
yeah. It was a thing to do in high school.
I know it was a thing. In high school.
Yeah, I can't remember who all I'm blood brothers with, but yeah, you just poke your thumb and
like smear it together. Yeah. Did you ever read?
By the time I was a kid, it was Spit Brothers.
That also gross, but less dangerous. Probably nobody ever caught anything that way. But yeah, I remember in the 90s this sense that like don't do that.
Oh yeah, because of AIDS. I forgot. Yeah.
Well, people had just learned so much about bloodborne diseases and pathogens, and of course the AIDS epidemic had everybody terrified of blood and bodily fluids of all kinds. So I remember that kind of panic. I remember reading The Indian in the Cupboard. Did you read those books? You remember those books?
No,
they were they're the little boys in that book, like the characters. Or maybe I can't remember, but they do the blood brother ritual. And I remember like my mom reading this to me out loud and being like, don't ever do this. Yeah. But it's that kind of stuff. Like that's the idea of covenant, I think, is that kind of primal, carries that sense of a primal embodied agreement or partnership, something that can't be revoked or with really high stakes. And it's Genesis. The reason I started talking about that was because I think Genesis 15 really captures that kind of primal sense of the covenant, which is then repeated again in chapter 17. So now we have the Abraham and Sarai have already tried to take this into their own hands. Ishmael has already been born. And Abraham seems to think this is done. Like, this is how the promise is going to be fulfilled. The covenant is still in force. But we have a third version of the story here in chapter 17, where God establishes this covenant again with a new promise and a new sign. The promise here is, again, that you'll have a child and lots of descendants. And there's also the land. That's another piece, another important piece of this covenant. And we can talk a little bit more about that. But there's this idea that God's making this agreement with Abraham, and they're sealing it with a sign.
I think that one of the things that's so striking in this is that this is it isn't just a multitude of people, or fruitful, I think is the Hebrew word,
Yeah, that's
fertile
interesting.
or whatever.
Yeah.
But that,
I will make you exceedingly fruitful. Yeah.
and many nations, different people
nations,
groups.
plural.
The Hebrew is goyim. It's the word for Gentile. It's not just the Jewish nation, but somehow all these other nations are part of this promise.
Yeah, that's interesting too. The other idea that that might be helpful to talk a little bit about before we look more closely at the passage is the idea of circumcision. So I think this is the first time circumcision is mentioned in the Bible, but circumcision becomes a really important subject in the New Testament, certainly, but becomes kind of a marker of identity for the Jewish people. So here in chapter 17, when God makes this agreement with Abraham, they establish this covenant again. God changes Abram's name. This is when Abram becomes Abraham. And Abraham is circumcised as a sign of the covenant. Like, that's really, in a lot of ways, that's all Abraham has to do to keep this covenant, is be circumcised and circumcise the other males in his household. So this is removing the foreskin. It's like a surgical operation, or it's a religious ritual, but it's actually like a surgical thing. You're cutting off the foreskin on every male. Supposed to happen when they're a baby, but if it hasn't been done, you do it whenever God tells you.
When you're 99.
So Abraham, it's when he's 99. Ishmael, it's when he's 13. And then it just says all the other males, all the other servants, everybody else that's living with Abraham is circumcised too.
One thing in a general sense, this is so important to Paul.
Right.
And his understanding of his call and his understanding of what the gospel is. What Paul does is he says, look, Abraham and this covenant, it all existed before there was even a Torah, and that to understand who Jesus was and what his purpose was and what Paul's role as an apostle to the Gentiles was, he sees this as the central kind of theological foundation of that. I think that's also, at least in a general sense, something to keep in mind. This is foundational for Paul's whole theology, I think, of what it means to proclaim the gospel even, and what our purpose is. It's a transnational. I mean, clearly here, this covenant is not tied narrowly just to one nation, but it's about.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I think probably what I was starting to say, or what I was thinking about, was this is where the covenant feels most ethnic and or most rooted in ethnicity and nationhood, and the idea that This is our family does this thing. We have this physical sign, this embodied mark that says we're part of the in group, and it's tied to ethnicity. It's not explicitly. I mean, I'm not sure ethnicity is even a concept that makes sense to Abraham, like Abraham's thinking in terms of family or tribe. But like that's the marker of who's in and who's out. So I almost feel like this is, in this chapter, the covenant feels less universal.
Really?
Yeah.
I will make you the ancestor of a multitude of nations.
There's hints of it there, but then you also have anybody who's not circumcised is cut off from his people. So this idea that the covenant, the promise is still there, and that has hung around from chapter 12. But here it's so tied to a marker of ethnic identity.
But if it's tied to
or tribal identity,
if the covenant is a call, it wouldn't be unusual for there to be a unique sign for that unique call. It doesn't mean it's narrowly an ethnic covenant.
I don't think it has to be.
I'm probably reading in from my own theological assumptions, because what you just did was raise a question that I hadn't raised, and I think I'm going to think about this during our break.
Yeah. It's just something I was noticing in this chapter. The covenant feels narrower, less universal, less broad, and more tied to, like, it doesn't say you can't convert. It doesn't say some people aren't welcome to come and be circumcised. But there's also the idea that this is something you're doing when your children are 8 days old. So it's more like, this is our family, this is our tribal identity, and that's what it means to be part of this covenant with God. My guess is, and my reading would be, that these are competing strands in the tradition and different interpretations that are just kind of resting alongside each other in the text. Any other big picture stuff or kind of larger topics that might be helpful to talk about before we dive in and look closer?
I think that's a good introduction.
Yeah. Good time to take a break? All right. We'll be back.
You really messed me up on that. Let's see here. Well, this raises questions about what's religion, too, right? I mean, is this a religious act? What is this?
I think this is the most religious content we get in Genesis, where it's like, these are the rules you follow. This is how you do the ritual, and if you do this, it's fine. If you don't do this, you got to go.
I mean, an equivalent would be, unless you're baptized, you can't be saved.
Yeah. Although the salvation content is totally missing.
Right.
Like, the only salvation
kind
is just being part of the group.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, Scott, is it okay? Can we just get all the penis content out of the way?
Sure.
Right at the top. Let's keep talking circumcision for a little while, and then we'll move on to names, and we'll be done with the penis stuff.
Okay.
Sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Because we've been talking during the break. We've been trying to sort out what's going on here, and have maybe a few thoughts, lots of questions. But essentially, we've been talking about how exclusive an act this is. Like, so in this chapter, God instructs Abraham to circumcise himself. And speaking of which, this is something I've been wondering about, is like, who does that? Is Abraham physically doing these circumcisions on all the
99,
males?
how steady is his hand?
Right. Is he doing his own, or does he deputize somebody? Is Sarai involved in any of this? I have no idea.
Well, nobody's been trained, right?
I assume these are the first circumcisions anybody's ever done. So, practically speaking, I don't know how all this goes, or whether they even have sterile instruments. But God instructs Abraham to circumcise himself and all the males in his household. And this becomes the sign of the covenant, at least for some branches of Abraham's descendants. So this story is preserved in the book of Genesis, and it's some of the only like ritual religious content we really have in the book. Like it's describing a ritual that has to be done. The idea is that every male child is going to be circumcised on the eighth day of their life. And if they don't, they'll be cut off from their people. That's kind of the line we've been looking at, focusing on, and trying to...
if they don't cut it off, they'll be cut off.
Exactly. I was trying to decide if that's wordplay. Do you think it is?
It probably is. I didn't look at it in Hebrew, but I bet you it is.
Yeah.
That's so...
It feels like it. If it's not, it feels like a missed opportunity.
Well, no, Hebrew's so good at wordplay anyway. So.
Yeah. But there's this idea that you have to be physically circumcised to be part of this community or to have any part of this covenant with God, which feels like it's at odds with the more universal covenant God seems to be creating with Abraham earlier in the book of Genesis, and even in this chapter where there's this idea that whole nations are going to come from you, kings, that you'll be blessed to be a blessing. Now we have this idea that to be blessed means to be part of this community, and you have to do things our way to be part of it.
Although it still has this has a mix of both.
I think chapter. So, yeah.
And also, this raises an important question about how to read the Bible in general. We have 3 pretty distinct traditions related to Abraham and his call and all of that.
Yeah.
How, if you have 3 different ones, how do you make theological sense of it? How do you interpret? How do you weave together an interpretation out of 3 traditions that depart in different ways? One that seems so clearly outward focused, being a blessing to absolutely every soul that lives on planet Earth. And then 17 feels much more exclusive. It's so tied to unique identity, God's chosen people.
Yeah.
How do you make sense of it when you have such different traditions?
Yeah.
In the Bible.
Yeah, I think it's really hard. Like I don't think there's a reading that perfectly harmonizes all of this. I think those ideas are genuinely fighting with each other.
And I think about how in my time of preaching every Sunday, what I would do was, if I was preaching from Genesis 12, I would just preach from Genesis 12. I wouldn't introduce the other ones in. I would just try to focus on that one.
Yeah.
But having them all 3,
the narrow focus makes it manageable, but then at some point you do have to like pull back and remember. And Nick is good at asking us these questions, actually, of like, but isn't this thing going to happen later? Or how does that jive with the thing we talked about 2 weeks ago? You can, if you're just looking at one chapter, you can make sense out of anything. But then if you try to look at 2 or 3 stories together, it becomes almost a jumble, almost impossible to parse.
That's one of the, at least for me, one of the things about what we're doing in this podcast is that, to say, it is a difficult book to make sense of. I mean, it is hard to have an interpretation that can take all of this into account that really makes sense.
Yeah.
It also makes sense that we have different traditions and they got put together and nobody tried to explain their relationship. They're just in there.
Yeah. And this story we know is associated with kind of the priestly tradition in ancient Israel. So this story, we think, probably emerged from temple practice or from like the religious practice of ancient Israel. Like circumcision was a ritual they used. And so this story kind of explains where it came from, why it's so important, why we're still doing it today. And this story makes a lot of sense when you think about it as an origin story for a ritual that's still being practiced in communities. Do you have you ever heard anybody? I don't know that I have, but I've probably just not done the research and didn't think to do it before today. But I'm going to start this conversation anyway. What do you make of like just the infatuation with penises in general? Like why would this be the sign? Do you think there's something there? Is this
Well, my goodness, phallic symbols are all through the Old Testament, and
right, and through cultures in general? Like this is not the Bible being.
And the prophets are constantly slamming the nation for being preoccupied with phalluses as well. And
that's
fertility
a good point.
cults and.
Which is kind of a funny thing to criticize Israel for when you're religious
you start
identity.
off life and you kind of are forced to recognize
around
ooh, what's that thing that hurts so bad? Yeah. Well, and what makes it more interesting, I think, is how affected we are by our Puritan heritage. I think our culture, American culture, I'd say in particular, we're just super obsessed about sexual stuff. I think in unhealthy ways. And, I've been around the world, many, many different countries, and I've never found a country as uptight about sexual concerns as we are.
Yeah. Sometimes I think it can be a thing that is under the surface in cultures. Like it's often like you have to get to know a culture pretty well to discover their hangups. Although I think you're probably right that that's less true in 21st century U.S. culture. Like our hangups we wear pretty proudly on our sleeves. That's a good point.
But I mean, clearly this stuff is just sexuality. I mean, it's not hidden. It's in the old. Yeah, it's just out there.
It's not explicitly the text doesn't make any reference to even to fertility or to explicitly to sexuality. Like God does not make a big deal. God makes a big deal about this ritual, but not in any way that ties it to biological function or sexual function, or even the metaphorical levels of kind of your biology. But there's it has to resonate.
There is a connection. So verse 6 of this chapter, I will make you exceedingly fruitful. And that fruitful is related to reproduction.
Right.
I'm thinking even Genesis 1, be fruitful and multiply.
That's true. The whole story is about sex, even though it's never explicitly
so it would make sense that the penis is clearly associated. I mean, even they understood this is how it works,
right? Yeah, I mean, I assume Abraham and Sarah
and
are
so
trying.
Is it highlighting the importance? You need to use this thing and make lots of babies.
Or maybe if you'd have done this earlier, you'd have had a child earlier. Is circumcision the key that unlocks the birth of Isaac? I don't know. I don't think there's any medical reason that would be true, but that might be a suggestion in the narrative.
Yeah, I've never done deep research into the ancient history of circumcision. It's making me want to do that.
It's not an exclusively Hebrew practice. It's a practice now that's culturally associated with the Hebrew scriptures and the Jewish tradition. But at this time, it was a religious practice, a cultural practice in Egypt and several other cultures that would have bordered ancient Israel. It was not a practice. So I'm going to forget all the names. I remember clearly that the Philistines did not practice circumcision. So there was some sense in which this was a thing that set the people of Israel apart from some of the neighbors that they were often in conflict with. But it wasn't their practice exclusively. This was not the first time anybody had been circumcised. This was the thing other cultures did.
But it certainly isn't a coincidence that the circumcision of the penis and the promise of being fruitful, there has to be
I think
a connection
there.
There
Is a connection there, even if the text doesn't really make it explicit. It's also, I mean, there's not a sense in the Old Testament that women are not part of the community, or that that they're not fully members of the tribe. But I do think when a ritual that's so closely tied to your identity is exclusively practiced by the male members of the community, there has to be a sense, even if it's not made explicit, that women aren't fully part of this covenant. I don't think that is explicitly said, but I do think it's kind of suggested by this story.
Or
do you get that sense?
Or just that the decision of the man
is the one that matters.
That there's no agency for women. I think that's more the issue.
Yeah. Which is, it's just another reminder that this, of the cultural assumptions behind so many of these stories and these texts, where women are participants and characters and important parts of these stories, but they're not treated the same way the men are. And nobody even says, like, women obviously can't do this, but they're still part of the community. Like, nobody even asks the question.
It wasn't until the 1970s that women were allowed to have credit cards in the United States.
Yeah, which is
so like, we're not that far removed from ancient ways of thinking.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Or women couldn't vote. There's this historic oppressive patriarchy, throughout human history.
Yeah. Any other circumcision content we need to do? I think we've said enough.
Yeah, I think for me the question is what is the covenant?
Yeah.
Because I see two different things. There's the covenant associated with being fruitful, many nations.
Yeah, so that's what God is going to do for Abraham.
But then he uses the covenant shall also be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. So the act itself is a covenant.
There's not a lot here as far as like requirements for Abraham or rules that Abraham has to follow. Like, his end of the covenant is really vague.
Just be fruitful.
On one hand, it's really vague. In the first verse of this chapter, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, "I'm God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless." So maybe that's part of the covenant is Abraham has to live well,
a righteous,
a
life
be
of faith.
righteous, be blameless, whatever that means. We don't know what God considers blameworthy, except not being circumcised.
Well, we know he was justified by his faith.
That's what Paul says, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Paul reads back the idea of faith and belief into this, but God doesn't say that. Like, the only stipulation God makes for Abraham to be keeping this covenant is to be circumcised.
And maybe this being blameless.
And maybe being blameless, too. I think there's, like, that has to be understood. Like, Abraham, you've got to follow the rules, whatever they are.
Yeah, just don't be a scoundrel.
Yeah. And I don't think Genesis cares about those rules as far as, like, what does it mean to be a good person? What does it mean to sin or be blameless? I don't think those are really ideas that this part of Genesis is
very
that
basic
worried about.
human ethics.
Yeah. Maybe just like doing what God says. Is it as basic
Well,
as
in
that?
Genesis 7, we have the Noahide laws, the 7 laws God gave Noah.
Uh-huh.
And that's the closest thing to an ethical law in Genesis.
Yeah. And there's like the rules in the creation stories, like you can eat this, don't eat that. And breaking those rules. God doesn't like it when people break those rules, apparently.
If I'm remembering correctly, in the Genesis 7, when one of the laws is if you're going to eat an animal, you have to kill it. You can't like cut a limb off, keep the animal alive so you can have a limb for the next day. So it's
Every time.
Yeah,
I
humane.
think about that.
Be humane towards your animals. That was one of the laws.
Yeah. But here, there's at least the only really explicit stipulation is you have to be circumcised. And all your descendants need to be circumcised as well. And if they're not, there's a very explicit threat here that if you're not circumcised, you'll be cut off from the people. Don't let somebody be part of the community if they haven't done this thing.
And I don't remember if I said this during our break or before, but it's not the same thing. But, growing up as a Baptist, there was a whole debate about whether you had to be baptized to be saved. That you couldn't go to heaven unless you were baptized. That religious act in and of itself was the thing. There's a similarity of thinking here.
Yeah, I think it's a very like a common religious idea that this ritual is what makes you part of the community. This ritual is what gets you right with God. And if you don't do it, you're out of luck. Yeah. An idea that drove, like to your point, the Apostle Paul absolutely crazy. I think that's one of the ideas that Paul rejects most soundly. But Abraham didn't.
And Paul goes to Abraham to prove his point, but he goes to one of the story. He goes to the 12, Genesis 12. That's his theological foundation.
Yeah.
He doesn't go to 17.
Yeah. Well, and he's got a good point. God chose Abraham long before, at least 25 years before Abraham had done this. So obviously it's not required. But now it's required. Let's talk about the name change. That's what we actually came here to do.
Yeah.
Before we got sidetracked.
Well, and actually, it's an extension of all this.
Yeah, I think so. What is changing here that this name change represents? So we talked a little bit about this, like names are changed at key moments. Like you don't change someone's name for nothing. And so the change from Abram to Abraham, from Sarai to Sarah, actually suggests that their relationship with God is evolving, that their function in this story is about to change. You know the languages better than I do. What's the translation you prefer for Abram to
Abram
Abraham?
is an Akkadian name. So it's not a Hebrew name originally, and it means exalted father. I don't know like what that meaning that would create in somebody's mind. What an exalted father is.
Probably just felt kind of ironic for a long time.
Right. And then the change to Abraham, that's a Hebrew, and it's a combination of Abba, or for father, the Hebrew word for father, and then a truncated version of Goyim, which is people or ethnic groups or nations. So it's a fusion of the father of nations.
What's significant about Sarah's name?
I didn't look at Sarah's name before this. So.
I didn't either.
And I mean,
there's not as, I mean, I looked through.
It would be interesting to know if
Commentaries
her
and
name is
notes.
also originally Akkadian. I don't know, but
Yeah, I did read something about this, and I'm going to forget what it was. I'll try see if I can dredge it up as we're talking. And
that's an interesting idea. If your name is from if you have, say, I'm French,
uh-huh.
and then come to the U.S., and a lot of people do this. They choose English names, right? Immigrants.
Yeah.
So they fit in better.
Yeah. And
so
Sarah
he has
is the name that makes more sense in Hebrew. I remember that for sure. Like it just fits grammatically better.
But it's if it's an Akkadian name and he was a part of a different culture and world and fully immersed in that, and it's to come out of it, and so you're no longer Akkadian or whatever.
Yeah.
I'm starting something brand new here. It's also interesting. Abraham wouldn't have spoke Hebrew, probably. That language hadn't evolved yet.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting too. I do think there's some sense that this is like, okay, now the promises are kicking into high gear. Like we're actually going to start this process now that you're 100 years old. And I think that's the significance of his age. Like he's 99 when this promise is made. But then it takes about a year, obviously, for a child to be born. So Abraham is 100 years old when the next phase of this covenant begins to unfold.
And even then, with the Ishmael and Isaac, even that doesn't feel super fruitful.
No, it's really just two children at this point.
And it's still like he doesn't really ever see like what this is going to look like down the road.
Abraham dies. Doesn't Abraham die even before Jacob and Esau are born? So
yeah,
it's a fairly small family through Abraham's lifetime. It's not till Jacob. I mean, Jacob has 12 sons who become the patriarchs of 12 tribes. So by the end of the book of Genesis, you start to see, okay, Abraham really was the father of a lot of people.
And you mentioned origin stories. And what happens with origin stories as you're reading into these ancient traditions, you're reshaping what probably happened historically, and you're using it to explain what you do now or how you think now. And what it was like for Abraham actually. Yeah. We don't have any testimony from Abraham himself.
Yeah, as a historical figure, Abraham is impossible. Like we can't really say whether someone named Abraham lived like this, whether there's any historical person behind these stories, or whether
I recall there might be one archaeological find that hinted at the possibility of a real Abraham. But that was about it.
Yeah. It would be so tenuous. Like it would, we're talking about such a long time ago.
3,000 to 4,000 years ago, probably.
Yeah. And we're not talking about a place. I mean, you have references throughout these stories to tents. Like we're not talking about a culture that would have left like long-term archaeological evidence like buildings or monuments. We're talking about a mostly pre-literate culture where most stories and traditions would have been passed down orally. Like we're centuries away from
this
widespread
predates
writing.
cuneiform, so
Yeah. So who Abraham actually was, whether Abraham is anybody's name, and whether these stories have anything to do with a historical person is pretty much impossible to say. But the figure is still incredibly important. Like the tradition has to start somewhere, and so whether Abraham was a historical person or not somebody started all this. Like somebody was the first one to start doing these things. And I think it makes sense to tell stories about those. I understand why we tell stories about those people. Do you see, what do you make of Ishmael in these stories? Like, Ishmael kind of just disappears fairly early on. Like, he's growing up, he's 13 years old. In this story, we have one more Ishmael story when, like, he and Isaac, Abraham's other son, there's like conflict between them, right? And that's when Ishmael and Hagar get banished. They totally drop out of the narrative.
He does get a consolation prize here.
He does. Like, I actually love these lines. God, what does it say? I'll make my covenant between me and you. God says to Abram, I'm going to make my covenant with you and make you exceedingly numerous. You'll be the ancestor of a multitude of nations. And when is it?
It's verse 20 is where Ishmael.
Oh, yeah, I'm on the wrong side.
As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I don't know who the you is. Is it Ishmael?
It's Abraham. No.
Okay.
So Abraham says, I've got a son. Like, Abraham is advocating
that's
for
right.
Ishmael in verse 18. Oh, that Ishmael might live in your sight. Like, I like this one. Like, Ishmael's great. He's 13. Like, we don't need to do all this again. Like, it's hard to change diapers or whatever. Can't we just stick with the son I already have? And God says no, that's not the plan. But God also says, I hear you. I love Ishmael too. And Ishmael will also be his own nations. It's just a separate thing. Yeah.
12, he shall be the father of 12 princes. But we never hear that story.
Yeah, it's like a parallel story that starts. We have just the beginning of it. The idea that Ishmael is also blessed by God, but is not part of.
But we don't know who those 12 princes are. We don't know. We don't know what that. I mean, I think a Christian interpretation of that is that's where Islam comes from.
Yeah, which is
unfair, completely
kind of insane.
Yeah,
yeah.
So it shows you how poorly we can use the Bible sometimes. But yeah, I'd love to know what happened.
Yeah. Do you read this as? So again, I think Christians especially are always reading our Christian theology back into these stories. God does explicitly say here, my covenant is with Isaac. So God has told Abraham, you're going to have a son. You're going to have another son. You're going to call him Isaac. And my covenant is with him. Does that, like here, I think we have this kind of that exclusive.
And then Isaac
thing
gets
we
a
were
name
talking
change.
About. What does Isaac get?
No.
Jacob gets
yes. The name. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jacob gets the name changed to Israel.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. I think we have that kind of exclusivity. I think we have that exclusivity here where Ishmael can still be blessed. Like it definitely doesn't say God doesn't care about Ishmael, but this covenant, this special relationship to God is just for Abraham's descendants.
This is interesting then. Is
Abraham
Ishmael
and Sarah's
not part of that covenant then?
That's what I think. That's how I read it.
So
is that this covenant covers Abraham and Sarah's blood descendants. So that's a fairly narrow ethnic identity. Like just if you can trace your bloodline back to these two people, you have a part in this covenant, and you've been circumcised if you're a dude. Then you have a part in this covenant. If you can't, then God might still bless you, but you're not as special as we are. That's a kind of a tricky idea.
Well, and
kind of troubling.
Well, I think I think all, just as human beings, are fundamentally egotistical. I think it's part of our condition. I think cultures can be that way too, and I think there's some of that going on here. This kind of ethnic identity, but there's a tension here. It's ethnic identity. We're the ones, but yet out of us, we're still part of the world, and but yeah, that's a hard question. And
I wonder if that tension is just built into any monotheistic religion. Like, you, on the one hand, if there's only one God who created everything and is responsible for this whole world, like, you have to acknowledge at some point that it's not just about us.
mm-hmm.
But then so much of our life, so much of our faith, so much of our religious practice is about ourselves getting right with God, or doing the right things, or being at peace with the universe, whatever it is. Like, that's such a personal thing, and such a, if you're like, you're following God the way you want to, or the way you feel called to, and you can't help but recognize that not everybody does that. So even though you know in theory that God is not just for you and not just your God, if there's only one God, it still feels like there's a lot of people not listening.
Well,
to
that's
God.
the way. Yeah, that's the way I grew up, and I can't. I don't have memories of how this would have been preached or taught. I just can't conjure those memories up, but I don't remember ever having anything that even slightly leaned toward a more universalistic view of Christianity, that somehow it's expansive in nature. It always felt very kind of closed in the way I grew up. It was
so Christians kind of take this story, ignore the literal sense. You have to, what Christians have to do is reject the literal sense of the story. And Paul kind of helps them do that.
Well, then baptism becomes the replacement for circumcision, right?
For some people,
right.
Yeah. So Christians have to spiritualize this covenant and say, like, obviously God doesn't just care about physical circumcision. What you have to do to be part of the covenant is believe in Jesus, or at least that's what.
But there's even a debate within the church, right?
Whether
we need to still do. Yeah.
In the early church, you have a debate about whether you still have to be circumcised, and then certainly to the present day, you have debates about whether that ritual has to be replaced with another Christian ritual like baptism. And then some people would say you just have to believe. Some people would say you don't have to believe. It's just about what God chooses. It's...
And as more and more Gentiles came into the church, that created this crisis of identity, right? Who are we?
Yeah.
We don't have an ethnic identity. That's a scary thing. I think it speaks to our own culture right now and what we're dealing with the whole question related to immigration and who are these immigrants? Are we an ethnic nation? No, we're not. But I think we unconsciously think that way.
Yeah. Is that what you think this is? Is that what this story is about? This chapter from the book of Genesis, is it about getting clarity about who's in and who's out? It's about like setting the boundaries around that identity in a world where that kind of stuff is really confusing.
If indeed this particular chapter comes from the priestly tradition, which it likely does, it would make sense that it's the priestly types, the religious types that get obsessed with these questions.
Yeah.
Who's in and who's out. Because in Genesis 12, which would be the one I would prefer. That's my origin story. I prefer. It's not a who's in and who's out kind of a story.
Yeah.
So I think religious types. I mean, so how many wars have been waged for religious reasons, right? Or the Crusades. What was that about?
What was it about?
It's
I'm
to
not
force
sure I know.
to force
Yeah.
Muslims to convert at the
Certainly the religious motivation was how you got people to sign up.
Mm-hmm.
We're gonna go reclaim the Holy Land,
right,
these
and that's a
holy
religious
sites.
motivation,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, of course, it was for the people funding it. It was probably more about what
Conquest
they would bring
yeah.
home and
Mm-hmm.
taxes and plunder and all these things.
But yeah, I think we have. I think a lot of Christians, my experience within the evangelical church, I think we just have such a small world, and I just don't. Yeah, this passage seems kind of like it might be circling in a little bit, very ethnic oriented, very religious oriented, but there's certainly plenty to offset that.
Yeah, in the Bible, even in the book of Genesis,
Mm-hmm.
I do think they're even beyond like the religious dimensions of this, which this is, I think, about a religious ritual or a ritual that maybe a tribal ritual, an ethnic ritual that then takes on religious meanings over the centuries. There's also, I do think that's just a natural thing, a natural impulse that people have. This chapter feels like it's about getting clear about who we are. And maybe that doesn't have to be like the fact that some people are left out of that feels almost like a side effect, like an unintended consequence, maybe. I don't think that's necessarily what this story is supposed to be about, even though I can't read it without seeing everybody who's not part of this covenant. I think it's more about this is who we are. It's about strengthening our identity rather than about diminishing someone else's.
Now, here's a thought, and I don't know where this thought came from for me, but the idea that circumcision was a replacement for child sacrifice.
Oh, I've never heard that before.
And I don't know where. I don't even know if it's a historically accurate idea or not, but it would make at least a little bit of sense.
That makes sense. Yes.
Because you got the Abraham Isaac sacrifice, down the road.
You have a literally, we're back to penis talk. With circumcision, it is a spooky blood brothery, also gendered. This kind of primal ritual. Like if you really think about it, like it's a blood sacrifice of a little part of yourself that's really important to a lot of men.
That's associated with bringing forth children.
Yeah, you are giving something up. It's not only painful, but it's literally a little piece of your flesh and blood given to God. And what is God doing with all these foreskins? I don't know.
But it would make sense that if God is trying to move humanity out of this,
right? I'd rather have a bunch of foreskins than a bunch of dead kids.
Right.
Yeah.
And Israel kept struggling with going back to human sacrifice, even so. It's
and you've got the great that dimension of it becomes clear. It's the only thing that's clear in the Exodus story. The Moses story. Do you know the one I'm talking about? Where Moses is coming back. So it's right after the chapter we read last time.
Okay.
Moses is on the way back to Egypt, and they stop at an inn, and he has not circumcised his son.
Yeah.
You remember that? And Zipporah, Moses' wife, does it spur of the moment and like throws the foreskin on Moses' feet. It's the most bizarre thing, but it starts to make a little bit more sense.
And what are Moses' feet?
Or exactly. Yes. So maybe a euphemism, like it's a weird story, and it's all happening because God has just showed up to kill Moses or to kill the child. Like, it's a spooky story. It's a bizarre story. It's a story that Christian theologians have just completely ignored because you can't make any sense out of it. But it does start to make a little bit of sense when you remember, or if you considered that circumcision was a replacement for or a milder version of a much more violent, much more costly system of sacrifice.
And that's one of the things. Maybe this is one of the blessings. That God is trying to move humanity away from sacred violence, which is a interest of mine in a broader sense.
It's so funny, too, that circumcision continues to be practiced so widely in so many cultures, even though there's no reason to do it in almost every single case.
And I mean, I'm circumcised. That just as a matter of fact, it wasn't a religious choice. It just happens.
Our son was circumcised less than 10 years ago, and it wasn't even, I didn't even think about it. They didn't even ask, like they just said, and then this will happen on whatever day, because that's what we do. Like, that's the standard practice. And I was like in a fog, not even thinking like, wait, why are we doing?
Well, I have a friend
this?
who's a doctor who says there really isn't a medical reason.
There's no reason. I've since done more reading about it. Like, there's no reason to do it. It can cause complications. It's not comfortable. Like, babies feel pain. Like, they don't want you to do this.
It's just a bizarre thing. But if it's a step away, I want you to do something different.
Yeah.
Maybe you still associate fertility with sacrifice and all this stuff, but let's dial it back a little.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting.
And then we get to the New Testament and Jesus, and this bloody, gruesome death on a cross is the end of all sacrifice. Maybe it isn't the sacrifice that God needed to satisfy God. Maybe it's the sacrifice that ends sacrifice.
Yeah, that shows us how absurd this whole thing is. Like, God doesn't need your foreskins, people. But maybe we need to give them.
Yeah. And this just
we're back
brings,
on penises.
Yeah, this brings to mind, though, if you look at some of this stuff like we're looking at today, and then read alongside some of the prophetic literature, the prophets are always calling out the religious obsession of God's people.
Yeah, who says circumcise your hearts? Whose line is that? Do you remember?
Is that Hosea? No.
I can't remember.
Yeah.
It's a good line, though.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
this idea, like, stop focusing on these rituals.
What does God require of us?
Yeah.
Well, and
foreskins.
Why
so many foreskins?
Religion. Why are we so obsessed with religion? Having these, I mean,
because it makes sense.
It
makes sense out of the world. But it can go it can become too much of an obsession.
Well, it'd be the same thing with the Bible. It can become such a religious obsession that we distort it,
Yeah. And as long as it is making sense out of the world, that's great. I think it can distort. Like, these ideas can make the world make even less sense if you hold them too tightly or hold them in unhealthy ways.
And I would say that was why I never felt at home spiritually in the way I grew up, because it felt to me like it just felt odd to me, like you're trying to make it didn't seem logical. What
I'm sure it wasn't.
Yeah, but yet it's the only way. It's the right way.
There's not a lot of logic in these stories.
Right. And I was a science math nerd growing up, high school, and it never computed,
Yeah.
And so this religious mindset and who knows, like, ultimately why this chapter was in there, but it has that feeling to it. And
I think we're closing in on, I think we've said almost everything we want to say. I did want to highlight Abraham's reaction when God says, again, God reiterates this promise that you're going to have another child. Sarah is going to have a child. And Abraham laughs. There's two moments in these stories, this chapter and then the next chapter, I believe, where Abraham and Sarah both laugh at God. And the exact connotation's not totally clear. Like, is it like a joyful
or a mocking?
Or are they literally laughing at this absurd thing that God has said? But Abraham even says, like, I'm 100 years old. Like,
are you crazy?
Sarah's 90. Like, that's not how the world works, God. And that's where Isaac's name, since we're talking about names,
right,
the name Isaac. So Abraham and Sarah's son is literally named after laughter or smiles. It's very close to the Hebrew word for laughter. And this is where it comes from. Do you know what we forgot to do?
Take it or leave it.
Yeah, we can do it now.
I'm leaving this one.
Yeah, it's unanimous. I'm leaving this. I don't.
This would not be my go-to for an Abraham story.
No, we've got 3 covenant stories, and this is my 3rd favorite. I would probably keep the other 2, but this one I leave. There's some unhelpful religious ideas here.
So here's the thing, and this will sound sacrilegious to some people, but I don't think we would lose anything if we didn't have that chapter.
No, everything good here is said somewhere else more clearly. Yeah. So, yeah, all right, unanimous. This can go. We don't need it. Any final thoughts? Anything else you want to talk about?
I think that's it.
Yeah, I think we covered it for now. We might think of things we want to come back to in the future, but for now, I think we've talked about everything we had highlighted. So thanks. Thanks, Scott. Thank you to Nick Mandog Smith for producing and editing our show. Thank you to our executive producer, Jay Kennedy. Thank you to the congregation at First Baptist Church of Indianapolis. And thank you to all of you, our listeners. Please do remember to rate, review, and subscribe. That does mean so much to us and helps us out. If you want to send in any questions, you can send them to unHoly Bible Study at unHoly Bible Study Podcast at gmail.com. We'd love to hear your questions. We'll try to address them soon on an upcoming episode. And if there's anything in the Bible you'd like to hear us talk about, you can send those suggestions there as well. Scott, any final thoughts?
No, I think we've covered it.
Cool. Well, we're probably going to keep talking about this, but you don't have to keep listening.